Now we have a very special session, and you don't see that very often. I think it's important to have some international aviation travel journalists explaining what they're doing, how they're doing it, and not just how or what they're doing. And don't ask them things, why the Dreamliner this or the... Forget it. I think it's important to know what their kind of work is, what their audience is. You expect something, why don't they put my thing in the news? And they say, you know, my audience is not interested in it, or my editor is not interested in it, he won't allow me to. And I think those are things that you should learn to understand, you know, and then you can work together. Then you could actually send them press releases or send them news because they are interested in it. On the other side, they're sitting on top of a load of information that you don't have as entrepreneurs. So, you know, they're really intelligence gatherers. And intelligence, I mean something else than this. Okay, I leave it up to Mikel. Mikel is from Barcelona. Mikel is a regular contributor to CNN for CNN Travel. And Mikel, maybe you want to introduce your colleagues, and the colleagues introduce themselves a little bit. I'll leave it all up to you. I'm out of it.
Yeah. Thank you for the intro, Bud. Yeah, as you mentioned, I cover aviation and travel for CNN as a freelancer. So I've got quite a lot of freedom to choose the topics, and then they need to go through a decision process, the editorial team. Before that, I also used to work for Flight Global, and I collaborate with some other media, more B2B, like Air Insight, some online digital media, not that much aviation, but more oriented towards travel and luxury travel. And, well, I think we've got a good representation here of different approaches to aviation journalism. Most of us here are freelancers, so we cover a wide spectrum of media, publications, B2B, B2C. So I think best thing is maybe each of us introduces himself or herself.
My name is Catherine Freedy, and thanks. And I'm a freelancer for several publications: Business Airports International, Low Fare and Regional Airlines, Interline. I've done work for Runway Girl Network and several other publications. But my core coverage is airlines and business aviation, and I like trends much more than I like reporting just the news. I like reporting what it all means rather than just reporting the news. So this is my third trip to St. Martin and environs, and I always love coming back. So if you have any questions about what I cover or how you can approach me, I'm very similar to Miquel, that I have to, when I go to a conference like this, I get story ideas, I pitch them to my various editors. I get about 70% of my stories picked up, and it may be over a year-long period, but I choose stories that are not being covered, and I watch for trends that nobody else is covering, so that's my sweet spot. Seth?
Hi, Seth Miller. I, like everyone else up here, write freelance for a number of outlets. My target market is in-flight passenger experience with a focus on entertainment and connectivity, which is a growing and changing business that probably means very little to most of the people here. But the other half of what I do is a big focus on route networks and development in that sense, generally in larger markets because access to the data and the information is easier, but conversations in a scenario like this are what I hope will allow to get into some of the sort of smaller markets in some of these, like the Caribbean, where you're not putting 787s or even A320s or 737s between all your cities, but where there really is demand for better and more reliable service.
Hi, I'm Chris Kelgard. I'm the equivalent of an Alaskan bush pilot with I've been an aviation journalist since 1980, so I've done quite a few things in that time. I've covered quite a lot of areas, and nowadays I write for various outlets. My real interest has evolved to be technology of aviation and aerospace, both on the commercial or civil side and on the military side, and I particularly love writing about aero engines, which not a lot of people do, because I regard them as the peak of where all the futuristic technologies meet. The aero engine is the most important part of the aircraft, really, in my opinion. So I guess I'm really focusing more on technology these days, but I love to catch a good news story when I can. And I'm always on the lookout for one. I've identified a couple of stories from this conference already, and I've no doubt that I'll probably end up with a whole handful of features and story ideas and write them over the next 6 to 8 months.
I guess I'm bringing up the back here. I'm Rob Mark, senior editor at Flying Magazine, and while I work full-time for Flying Now, which of course is focused normally on small airplanes, learning to fly, that sort of thing, the engine technology, avionics. The magazine is really trying to expand its reach and look at turbine-powered airplanes. And I think certainly turbine-powered airplanes piloted by single-owner pilots, or again, interesting stories that have to do with turbine pilots. But one aspect of this I think that's important is that while I'm an editor now, I spent 25 years as a freelancer out there doing what everybody else does here, is trying to figure out what the next good story is. And so I think that when you have a good story, it's important to not focus on just one magazine and say, that's the one it's got to be in, because you can rewrite the same story a couple of different ways that might work for different markets. But I'm sure we'll get into some of that kind of stuff later.
Actually, you went straight to the next point I wanted to make is basically what many people might be asking themselves here is what do I need to do to be featured in a specific story, a specific media, newspaper, magazine, etc. I can say from my experience, for example, the most well-known platform I write for is CNN, and here what they're looking for is basically stories that stand out. They're looking for things like, for example, we've got a very good example here in this conference is Adam Twiddle, that spoke earlier. Private Fly does a magnificent job with creating content. And one of the things they did is they created the contest for the most scenic airport landings. That's the type of story that, if done well, can work really, really well with, even with mass media like CNN, can get massive exposure. Of course, that's a very specific topic, but there are many opportunities out there. That's the way you approach topic and the way you present the content. You need to find a way to make it story attractive. Maybe you can put it into the context of a wider trend. For example, at CNN, we love articles that we can set in a setting like the best 10 airports in the world, things like that, the best 10 resorts. This is the type of story that normally does really well. And when you have the topic, you can always find a specific angle that relates to specific place, specific people, company, etc. And but always set in a wider context, a major trend or something that you can relate to other stories that are happening at the time. I don't know if that's the same you do, guys.
Yeah, to sort of add to that, but also bring up a different angle. I can't remember the last time I wrote a top 10 story for anything. Maybe like top 3 seats that are brand new coming out of a trade show that you'd never want to fly in. That story actually did really well because they were terribly uncomfortable seats and people got scared. But you're talking about these sort of top 10 types list stories. That's not what I cover. And as it works with relating to the folks in the room here, I think the important message there is understand what you're pitching and to whom. And if you want to tell a great story about the St. Martin Airport, you can pitch it to Miguel as one of the top 10 scenic places to go watch and the plane spotting and stuff like that. For what I'm writing, the important part may be its role as the regional hub or the potential for TSA pre-clearance or something like that. So if you send me a story about, hey, look how cool our airport is, I'm an av geek. I'm going to enjoy that. I'm going to look at the pictures. It's going to be great, but I'm not going to publish a story out of that because my editors don't want that and it's not what I produce. And so understanding what the different publications are focused on and who works where and what those contacts you have are producing, if you can get to a point where you have that figured out, your odds of getting your story published increase exponentially. You get the other half of that is if you keep sending me the story that I keep saying no to, you just piss me off. And then you do send me the good one, I'm like, yeah, but they pissed me off. And I don't know that I want to write it anymore, even though you gave me a good one finally. So there's a real balancing act there.
I think also you have to really do your own homework and read the publications that you want to get into over a long time. See what they're covering, how they're covering it, and figure out an angle to your story that fits in with that publication. And so for St. Martin, it would be a really good story as a regional hub, but there might be other story angles. So you have to do your homework and see on the publications you're targeting and seeing if there's a real fit. Without that, you're just throwing paper or an email at somebody and they get thousands of emails every day, and to rise to the top that they'll actually open that email is very tough.
I don't know if I'm on. There we go. Something I was going to ask is that for the people in the audience, how many of you have actually tried to pitch a reporter on a story idea? Okay. A few. All right. And Adam, I'm going to get to yours later, so no, I'm just kidding. But, it's an important issue that, when we talk about the publications that we write for, we don't pull all the topics out of thin air. We are often getting them from people on an email that said, gee, did you know that they're doing the top 10 landing airports in the Caribbean, or something, or someone will send us a video that relates to something we hadn't even thought of. And that's where the tips come from. So, if you work in the airport side of things, air traffic control or services, and you say, boy, they never talk about us. Well, it's because we don't know what you're doing. And we don't all have the time to call everybody and say, do you have any story ideas? Anything that's interesting or unique or different, or you have to find us. And then, of course, you have to put it in a format that makes sense. I can't tell you, and I'm sure my colleagues are running into the same problem. We get news releases sometimes that are so badly written, we can't even figure out what the point is. So, you need to spend a little time and make sure that we know what the most important aspect of the story is before you pitch us.
And I would add as well, there's some sort of maturation cycle here. Sometimes there are stories that are interesting, but we don't have an angle to publish, to write a piece immediately. But there are always some nuggets of information that we absorb, and they might be used in a few months' time, for example, when we have a topic that relates to that story. That happens quite often. So that's why, like many times people expect you will write a story immediately, but actually the value might be in making yourself known. And once you're in the radar, the chances increase that there's going to be a story about you or featuring you in the future, because there's, I don't know, there might be something happening in the world that make that theme or that topic more actual or more current. And then you go back to what you know about that topic, and then it's what you often you need to contact people, and those are the people that have been pitching you stories, and you go back to them, and then you can retake this information and use it again. But it might be, you never know, it might be even a year later, but it's important to be there, to be known.
I think something else that you just touched on that made me think about story ideas and pitches and whatever is that if a reporter, obviously any of us call, you want to pick up the phone right away. I mean, but seriously, I can't tell you how many times that we'll get a news release from somebody about something they say is really interesting that we want to write about, and I'll chase them and I cannot get them to call me back, or they won't respond to an email. And you know what? Talk about suicide. You are just shooting yourself in the foot, not just that time, but in the future, because when some company or some PR agency or whatever treats the reporters like that, they go, you know what, this is too much work. I'll go find another story. And so if you really have a good story, you need to kind of close that loop. If you send it to one of us, please follow up when we try to reach out to you.
I think it's a rule in public relations that somebody will send out a press release and then immediately go on vacation. And I can't tell you how many times somebody has sent me a press release, I've called, and they said, oh, well, he just left on vacation. Is there somebody else I can talk to? No, he's the only one. It's like, why did you do that to me? I will never talk to you again. So you really have to time your release, and if you're going to release something, be there for the phone call, because you're not going to get a phone call very often.
I think it's important to note, by the way, there's another way that media interacts with companies and with organizations. Quite often, the editor of a publication will decide a particular story or feature article that they want to have written, and it may be on airport lighting, or it may be on runway configuration, maybe on air traffic control services, could be on anything. On those occasions, we're the ones who reach out, and we call companies and organizations. I've spoken to quite a few of the organizations here, and we call them directly, and usually through the intermediary of a PR person. And I would say that if your organization is interested in having publicity, most organizations are, but not always. Some prefer staying off the record or very low profile. But if your organization is interested in having publicity, then I would suggest that whether you use a PR agency or in-house PR, that you instruct them to be very helpful when we reach out for original stories, stuff that's not based on press releases. More often, I find that most of what I do is actually reaching out to people for stuff that's not based on a press release to write a feature article about. And, you know, when you're writing a feature article, it might be not just a news story, it might be a 2,000-3,000 word article. So the organization or organizations which are profiled or which are, contribute to that article in terms of interviews and quotations and description, they get very, very substantial publicity from that. And as the old saying goes, there's no publicity is bad publicity. Certainly, free publicity is much better than advertising paid for publicity. I can tell you that.
I think another point that has to be made is how the journalism industry has changed over the last 20 years. And journalists, yes, they cover the news. There's no question about that. News story happens, they're all there. But the back of the house is thinking, how many clicks can I get, and what stories can I publish that will increase the clicks? So they're thinking in terms of what's in it for me. What is this story going to do for my profile online or publication or clicks or sharings and all this kind of stuff? So you really have to begin to think in those terms yourself. So when you present a story idea, you probably have to go to the point where what this will do for them. This is a unique story, nobody else is going to have it, and it has international repercussions. Now, I don't know that you have anything like that, but that's why I say that I like to concentrate on the trend stories and stories that move the conversation in a controversial issue. I do a lot on pilot shortage, and I did a 5-part series on every ramification around that pilot shortage, from the loss of air service to the cutting the pipeline between the student pilot and the right seat of an aircraft. Everything what the safety issues are, what the safety issues are not, et cetera, because that moved the conversation, and because it was controversial, the clicks went up. So I had 20,000 hits on one of those stories, 11,000 on another, 15 on another. So I think that, and my value to that editor is she will deliver clicks, and I mourn the loss of the journalism of the past, but we just can't. We don't have it now anymore, and you've got to think differently. You've got to pitch differently. So you have to be aware of all these things.
One aspect I think I wouldn't stress enough is the staying power of content. Besides you might get a spike in the number of clicks, you should be looking for content that stays relevant, that positions your company, your destination, your island, whatever is the activity you do. So when people are searching for things that relate to your topic, that you stay relevant, and often this is through content, and that content that is disseminated through specific media. Doesn't need to be like mass media like CNN, but it could be more niche channels. Again, I think Private Fly, we have Adam here, it's doing an excellent job in private aviation. If you do searches for many topics that relate to executive aviation, Private Fly often comes very near the top on Google. That's because they produce great content, and they know very well how to play the media in a way. Get the media to pick up the stories, get links.
What are you thinking? I think what you're talking about a little bit there is sort of the long tail of a post. And, I have stories that I've written 5-6 years ago that annually are my most read story. On my site, it's a story I wrote 5 years ago. And I will get a huge spike from anything new, and the more controversial, the better, absolutely. Not that I'm necessarily hunting out real controversy, but something that moves the conversation is always important. But there are certain stories that have that long tail, and if you can generate, if you have that kind of news, that's the kind of thing that, from our perspective is more useful. And for you ends up being more useful because you're selling or giving/publishing this story that ends up having a longer sort of lifespan than what you're originally thinking. Right? I love a story that gives me a big spike, but year over year I have to continue to generate traffic and continue to keep my readership because that's ultimately where the paycheck comes from. And so things that spike and immediately drop off aren't nearly as useful as maybe something that's a little smaller to start, sort of smolders, but keeps going for that long tail. So, obviously news is news, and if there's, something important and significant that happens, you tell that news story, you push that news story, you get in touch with media, you try to make that happen as well. But there are always other stories out there, and a lot of those are these sort of long tail type things. Maybe it's not a 3,000-word feature, but it's 1,000 words as opposed to the 200-word news blurb. Things like that, where you can really come up with these ideas of maybe it's not breaking news, and even you may not even think it's really news at all, but it's this kind of cool new thing we're doing, or it's a weird take on how we're bringing passengers in. Is it opening up a new seaplane base to try to move people to the remote end of the island that doesn't take an 8-hour taxi ferry service, and things like that. Just talking about the opportunity for that sort of thing and how the markets can shift. That has a much greater long-term potential, and it's sometimes hard to sell the long-term view of this sort of thing because you want that big, that immediate burst of traffic, you want that immediate burst of publicity. but over the longer span, you're going to do better with stories that have a little more staying power. And so are we.
So something I was going to add, though, too, is that from our perspective, we're looking for news stories. We're looking for things that we think our readers are going to really engage with. From your perspective, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people that have companies or that build products, that offer services, and they go, I don't know, I don't have anything to tell you. I mean, and so I think it demands a little curiosity on everybody's part to say, what do we do that you know, a reporter might be interested in? Because I can't, again, how many times people will tell me something they do, and I go, oh, that is great, that is such a neat story, and they think, you'd be interested in that? You know, so don't sell yourself short and say, well, everybody knows what we do. You know, we build floats for the caravan, or we build you know, widgets for this, that, or whatever, and who cares about that? You know, I mean, you'd be surprised, depending upon how we turn the story. It could be very interesting. Maybe there's somebody that's in your company that does something unique when they produce the product or the service. And so I think it's important to say, please, we'd rather have you send us an idea and give us an opportunity to evaluate it, even if we go, well, not this time, but, you know, thanks for sending it. I mean, rather that than say, you know, we don't know what to tell a reporter anyway, because there's always something.
Yeah, and actually, even if you're in B2B, one of the good things about aviation is that it really gets people excited, even people outside of the industry. So it's got a huge magnifying effect if you take the right approach. Even the most technical, specific topic, if the story is right and it's got the right elements, it can have a huge reach. Just because aviation is so I think it's just the visuals. I mean, airplanes. People love airplanes. People love to talk about travel, aircraft. Even people that don't know anything about the industry, it's easy to get them excited about this.
To get those who don't know anything excited, which you can see every time a negative story pops up. It's the ones who don't know anything that get really, really excited. So, double-edged sword there, but it usually works in our favor, I think.
I think another thing to remember, talking about the long tail of the story, and also the point that Rob made, print, it's often said that print is dead, but actually, I think there are more magazines out there today than there have ever been, magazine titles. And guess what? Stories that are actually in print live for a long time, because in an FBO or something, somebody can pick up a magazine 3 years later and see a story, you know, whether it's a short story or a feature article, and suddenly it's interesting. You know, it's a story that was written some time ago. And so don't roll print out entirely. Rob's publication, I think, is probably still printed by hard copy as well as online. The point that Rob made, I think, it's valuable to personalize, getting a lot of microphone pop here, it's valuable to personalize. If you have a story you want to push out, make sure that it's got a human angle to it, because most editors really like that. They really like, oh, there's a person behind this, and there's a story to be told about a person doing a job, or a person being involved in something. Just humanize the story a bit. It's almost irresistible to a great deal of publications.
If you see the Wall Street Journal center column, that's what at one time it was all about. A major story, but it put a human angle to it. So it led with the human story, and then came out through the pyramid that this was actually an example of what was in the news that week. So if you lead with the human angle, as Chris said, that's a really great way of doing it.
And also another angle that I wanted to comment about. Maybe it doesn't apply to the more B2B publications, but there's hunger for information, stories about places that are underreported. So that is an area that often, for example, and there's a symbiosis here with aviation, because the easier it gets to get to places, let's put it this way, as the aviation industry develops in certain places, it gets easy to get to places. There's a demand as well for stories to cover that specific area. That's something that happened in Eastern Europe, for example, where development of low-cost airlines like Wizz Air, for example, or Ryanair, EasyJet, flying to really what used to be very obscure destinations in places like Romania, Slovakia, Poland, has generated a lot of stories in the media, mainstream media, about what to do in these places, 10 things to do in that city, places that were not even thinkable as a tourist destination. So there's a symbiosis. Sometimes it's difficult to tell what comes first. I would say possibly first is the accessibility, but after that you get that one thing reinforces the other. As these destinations become more familiar to the mainstream public, there's an increasing demand as well for new stories, new angles. You might start with coverage that is pretty general and then digging down into more specific aspects. Could be food, it could be festivals, could be different aspects of life in that place.
I think, in a tourism environment, which is what we're really talking about here, many of us are more focused on the aviation, but there's a lot of tourism boards also participating here. That's the sort of thing that does help. If you help make those stories about the transportation stuff easier and more relevant and a better sale to the writer, to the publisher, to the readers, that helps build that tourism market, and especially for the developing tourism destinations. I think that becomes very, very important to sort of bring, we can bring a tourism story in behind it, but we need your help to establish that there's really is, this sort of up-and-coming tourism destination in a lot of cases. And so as we're talking about sort of expanding access within markets, and maybe it's a tourist destination, but we're adding new feed, and so it's somewhere that Americans aren't familiar with, but the Brits have been going forever. If we're adding more service from Fort Lauderdale or New York or something like that, you can bring in a different angle of the story and help sell it that way. And it grows and it continues to sort of benefit you, and it benefits us as we're building that story.
If you all noticed when Cuba was opened up, you couldn't pick up a tourism publication or general assignment publication without finding a story on Cuba. So that tells me, or should tell you, that newspapers are looking for the new and the different, and they want, when something big is happening, like a market that has been closed for 50 years opening up, everybody's going to go there, and they're all going to have their unique take on the story. So that goes back to the developing, newly developing tourism markets and how you can market to that. The other thing I wanted to say is watch the calendar. Rob brought it up, McQuell brought it up a wee bit and said festivals and things like that. Unique experience, the one that comes to mind is not so unique, but certainly we all think of Carnival. You got to go to Rio, and I wouldn't touch Rio with a 20-foot pole during Carnival because I don't like crowds. So if I were to be able to celebrate Carnival in a less crowded place, I'd maybe be interested in booking that experience. And indeed, this spring, or this just recently, both my daughters celebrated Carnival in Colombia, and I said, who knew? I mean, I didn't know it was celebrated any place. I mean, I'm not the brightest bulb in the, but I was thinking that, if you watch the calendar, if you watch TV, especially TV news, they watch the calendar very closely. So at the beginning of the year, it's all about weight loss. And you get into February, and it's all about romance. And then you get into March, and there's like a little lull. And then it's the summer fashions. And then it's then it's, okay, we're coming up on the vacation season. So then it's travel. And then, if you watch how soft stories are covered, it is covered on the calendar. So if you have something unique on the calendar that can give you, that provides a different experience, then I think you're going to be more likely to get success in pitching your story than if you didn't have a calendar connection. Because they're already thinking about, what do I do to cover Valentine's Day? Or what do I do to cover the beginning of the year? And how am I supposed to cover it differently than I've covered it for the last 15 years? So if you can offer them that option, then your success rate, I think, will go up.
I think that's one of the strengths that the Caribbean has with 30 odd nations and territories. Everywhere has got its own unique culture, and they're pretty much all worth sampling. If I were trying to give any advice at all, I don't know if I'd presume to, but to give any advice to a tourism director, I would say, you know what your country or territory's unique strengths are. I'm visiting one such after this conference, and highlight it, because may well be that no other place has got that. And everyone today craves, millennials too, by the way, crave unique experiences. And we all love them, whatever our ages are. We all love to go places that we haven't experienced before, do things, even if it's, just talking to people from a different culture, maybe different dialect, different language, beautiful scenery, ecological. I mean, Dominica last year was fascinating because it's such an ecological paradise, I would say that's a good thing to do in the Caribbean, is highlight your strengths. And I know it's very competitive among all the different countries, but nevertheless, I think there's a considerable resource there.
Well, we cover all. This was supposed to be a town hall type of meeting, so now maybe it's the turn to move on to questions. Yeah?
I got one in the back. Back there.
Okay, we've got the tourism director of Suriname. Let's be honest, he has hardly any money to. No, really. He has a very tough time promoting his country. Beautiful country. What can he do, or what can you do for him? Or what do you want them to do?
Right, I agree with you. But as every now and then, there will be travel advisory from countries, and very negative. So what, in your advice, can we do to tackle things like that? And then I have a second question, which is related to part-time writers. We have been working with them, and a lot of promises, but when they're back, the editor decides to do something else. So the sector gets disappointed.
I have an answer for that, because that's happened to me, where I come back with a great story and my magazine has moved on. I will write the story anyway, because I feel if I've got a good story, I'm going to write it. For instance, I went to China last year, and I was hosted at 2 hotels, and they really were amazing experiences, not just because they were uber luxurious, but they offered the traveler something very unique, a hot springs that was next to the terracotta warriors, and Hangzhou was something different. And I got great stories for my magazines out of that, but I also decided that even though none of my magazines needed hotel stuff, I did the hotel and I found a venue for it. So I began pitching it to travel publications, and I didn't get paid for those, and that's very rare that I'll do work that I don't get paid for, because I get paid precious little as it is. But I made sure that I found a venue for that publication. But that's just me. A lot of other writers will not do that. They'll say, my editor has moved on, and therefore, but I can tell you that there were on a second China trip, there were two publications. They ended up never writing anything, the reporters who were brought there. And I was talking to one of the PR people afterwards, and I sent them a link to my story, and they said, we're never gonna have, I asked, have you seen any other stories? And they said, so-and-so and so-and-so said they wouldn't write any stories, and they're never gonna be invited back. So they do, and they do share who doesn't live up to their part of the bargain, especially on fam trips.
I think a part of that is understanding who you're actually working with, and is it someone who is an influencer or a writer, or what their real goal is and what they're able to deliver. I think in many ways the market is sort of discovering that influencers might not actually have much influence to drive revenue, right? They can make people excited, they can make things, people happy, but you got to look at where the revenue is being driven, and if you're getting burned by that, it sucks. But to sort of understand, and part of that is getting a better understanding of who you're working with, and sort of what the opportunity is when you're hosting them. And part of it is working with, like Catherine said. I mean, I hate to say put together a blacklist with your colleagues of people who don't work well, but if people aren't delivering what they promise, they shouldn't be. And you need to help protect each other. This is part of the cooperation of bringing each other up together, and making the region better and the industry better. Is we all suffer that black mark when a writer shows up and promises you something and doesn't deliver it. So I don't think I've done that. I hope not. I might have just blacklisted myself. But I think that there is an opportunity to do that and work with your peers to make sure you're sort of able to measure, is it Instagram followers? Is it reach of a publication? What are we working with that matters to actually drive bookings, and making sure that you're able to, follow, the people you're working with are able to follow through on that.
And you can tell during the fam trip. One of the things that this PR person told me, she said, I knew this during the fam trip. I said, how did you know? And she said, remember I asked you all the time whether you were getting what you needed, and you always came back with a story idea here and a story idea there. They never did that. And so it was like halfway through the trip, I thought, these people are a waste of space. I should have invited somebody else. So going pretty much while they're on the trip, and you should be pumping them for, are you getting what you need, and what kind of story ideas are you getting, and kind of what are you going to do? Because it also sets up it's another message that we expect something from this.
Something I was going to add to follow up on that is that you have 5 journalists up here, so make sure you get our cards. And if you have an idea and you think, well, I'm going to organize this or try to send this person that I don't know very well there, and call one of us. Even if we don't get the assignment, we can give you our 2 cents. At least give you 2 or 3 questions that you might want to ask that writer to kind of make you feel, comfortable that you're picking the right person for the right job, and that's hard because you don't do what we do. So use us. We're happy to help.
Next time you're writing a story about the airport, I do want that story, and I want to help build that relationship. And so, if I can help you, I'm not going to do a ton of work, but if I can help you in a quick phone call, a quick email, something like that. Oh yeah, Catherine's great, Robert, whatever. If we can have that sort of quick back and forth and help, again, building this industry and making the industry work better is good for all of us. And so I think that we're all willing to do a little bit. Catherine's not going to write a lot of stories for free, but we can do a little bit of help for each other to sort of raise the tide a little bit.
I think we're all being a little shy as well, to be honest, because I think all of us here have actually fairly decent blogs, websites of our own that get reasonably well trafficked. And it's a very useful little tool in a freelance writer's arsenal when one is visiting on a press trip, or one is going on a general piece of travel, to not only have obviously a handful of commissions from different publications, but also one always knows that one can write for the kind of article one wants to write for one's own website. And I have done that many times. Seth has done that many, many times. Catherine's done that many times. Mikhail has done that many times. And Rob has done that many times.
A small airline in the Caribbean, well known, have some news every now and then. How interesting is that for an international journalist?
Well, I did a 7-page feature on that particular small airline when in a magazine, an aviation magazine that's published out of the United Kingdom, and it's seen around the world, you know, so that got a fair bit of publicity, that particular small airline.
I think it depends on what the story is. I don't know that I could give a blanket, you know, just because you're in the Caribbean, we don't care. Or really, because again, as we've all said, it's not the stuff we really care about, it's the people that use the stuff. Whether you're making something or performing a service, how are you doing this that's making for an interesting story? I don't care where it is, to tell you the truth. If it's a good story, we'll figure out a way to run it.
Yeah, I would differentiate between B2B and B2C. In B2C, for example, well, B2C, I mean, for the general public, sometimes you can make the story happen. I remember a certain lady that delivered pizza to Seba, for example, and that had a massive exposure worldwide through not only the journalists that were here when that happened, but many other media that pick up the story and that republish. So if you can achieve this virality, that's great. And sometimes you have to just take a good idea and just tweak it a little bit so that it can get this virality.
Has there ever been any pressure on you guys as journalists to write a soft story as opposed to the real story because an organization has hosted you and that sort of thing? And further, what impact has social media, new media have on your work as journalists?
Two very different questions. Has there ever been an effort to influence us based on being hosted all the time? I don't think it works on me. I'm sure I'm wrong, but I don't think I'd like to think that I have 100% my convictions and I'm telling the absolute truth every time. Sometimes that's not a good story, and maybe it's a lie of omission where I don't tell, oh my God, this was awful, but I find a different angle of something that was really good or was really interesting, and it changes the story that I was going to write, but I'm not necessarily always telling everything that happened on every trip just because too much stuff happens. There was a hair on the floor in the bathroom. Okay, like I could write a whole story about how awful housekeeping is, but that's stupid because the reality is the room was actually pretty clean and everything else was nice. Like that's that sort of thing. And do you get pressure from people? When we write a story for the outlets I write for, we don't run it by the host before it's published. We don't talk quotes with people before it's published. We do interviews, we do our research, and we publish the story. We have absolutely had pushback after things are published. We've actually had somewhere where I've talked to a vendor and said, you understand that you're telling me something no one else has been willing to say in public. I'm going to publish this tonight. Are you sure that's okay? And they said yes, and 30 minutes after we hit go, we got a phone call saying you need to take that down. And very politely said no. We still do, we still write with those people, we still work with those people. It sort of depends on the outlet in some cases, but I think you have to expect that the good people, the good journalists are, even if they're freelance, even if it's, a paid trip, are going to actually still behave as journalists.
I was approached before the conference by a PR agency for a particular company that's here. And they were kind of, would you like to meet with this guy? He's here. He's going to be at the conference. We think there's a nice branding story or something like that. And I politely wrote to the person, the agency person, said, that's not really what I think my outlets would be interested in talking about or writing about. But, I'd be very interested to meet the person anyway. And yes, this morning I did, and lo and behold, we had a lovely conversation, and I found that the company involved is certainly very interesting, and I would be planning to write about it in the future. Although, and that was down to the PR person. Their pitch was wrong, but the fact that they were somewhat persistent, actually. I was actually traveling last week, so I couldn't really get back to emails, reply to too many emails. But I thought it would be good to meet this person, and the story. I'm sure I will write one or more articles as a result in future weeks and months.
I think we might want to touch the social media answer real quick. There's a second question that was part of that. Social media changed everything I write about. I've written 30 or 40 tweets standing in the back of the room so far today. Some of them are pictures of planes landing that I took yesterday because that's always fun, but some of them are conversations about seaplanes, conversations about immigration in the Bahamas, things like that. Is 140 characters a story? Yes, actually it is. It's not a complete story. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 of them to tell a little chunk of a story. But that's also, for me, how I, especially in an event like this where there's a lot going on and things are moving, that's how I take notes in a lot of ways. These are the things that are interesting enough to me contemporaneously that I'm going to go back and say, you know what? These are some of the things that we talked about with pre-clearance and immigration. I'm going to go back and listen and watch the recordings and make sure I'm getting the quotes right later. But this is the kind of thing that I think is the story I want to tell. So from a true news type of event, not, it's different if you're visiting visiting somewhere and writing about, what happened along the way a little bit. But those are the things that were interesting enough to me at the time that's how I'm sort of bookmarking that time in my brain to go back and follow up. I don't know if anyone else plays the Twitters.
Oh, I do. I do. I get my stories from Twitter, and other journalists get their stories from Twitter, and et cetera. But I tweet out all my stories, and during conferences I tweet, and it usually gets retweeted, et cetera. The charm of Twitter is that. So that's a good way of using social media. I also do LinkedIn and Facebook because that's where most of the journalists go.
I totally agree that Twitter is a two-way communication channel, not only to get our stories out, but also to get insights about things that you might not have been thinking about. For example, one of the stories I wrote for CNN this year, it started with a very random tweet from the Siberian Times, which is a Twitter account that just publishes stories about things that happen in Siberia, in Russia. It was a very interesting story about a young lady in Siberia that is restoring an old Soviet airplane, a Soviet airliner, and that had been reported in the Russian media, but no one was talking about that in Western media. So I just got in touch with the people who were involved in this story. I pitched that to CNN, and they found it really interesting. So there we go. There we had the story out of a random tweet from Siberia. So that can happen to any other topic, any other place. You never know who's going to pick it up and where this is leading to.
So my question kind of ties into what you were just talking about. I'm just curious, how many stories, like when people just randomly put out a PR on one of those, we know all the ones, they just throw it out there. What % of those type of stories, press releases going out there, do you actually pick up and write stories on? Is it a very low % or is it a high %?
Low.
And then I have a follow-up once I know the %.
I agree with Chris that it's low, but there's a lot of press releases that I'll clip and put into a file, digital file, so that because it relates to something that I'm following, a trend that I'm following, so when I go back, I have the press release there and the contact people so I can get back to it.
And I'd say I write a very high percentage of the good ones. But, right, so, but the answer is it's low.
But an important aspect of that too is, Mike, you mentioned, what do we see on Twitter? Remember, none of us are up 24 hours a day. So if we're offline for a while and that happens to be the time that you send out the tweet with your press release on it, we may never see it. So remember, you can send it out more than once. I'm not saying barrage the industry and send it out 13 times in 2 days, but there's nothing that says that you must only send it once and keep your fingers crossed, because realize everybody's on a different time zone.
Excuse me, the U.S. president's up 24 hours a day tweeting.
One exception. You had a follow-up?
Okay,
Yes,
we're not going to talk about that.
You mentioned LinkedIn, and I know there's someone up there that I'm connected to, LinkedIn, and we talk a lot back and forth. So what are some of the platforms that maybe we're not aware of that people in PR or marketing should really be involved in building a relationship with you guys?
I think it makes all the difference. Like random press releases can have a very pretty low response rate, but if they make the effort of putting even a couple of lines explaining why that story is interesting, it's the same as in LinkedIn. I keep getting invitations to connect from people I don't know that want to connect with me for some reason, but they don't even put 2 lines just to say why they want to connect. I'm not against connecting with people I don't know, but tell me why. So that's a bit the same thing. If you just send a random release, the chances are pretty low. If you just build this relationship, maybe the first time it's not going to be interesting, but maybe if you are able to identify who's the person sending it, what topics is he or she working in, maybe that's the basis for a more long-term relationship where you might get some interesting stories in the future, which would be a mutually beneficial situation.
Even LinkedIn tells you to do that. Give them 2 lines why they should care about you.
Yeah, and what I would say for me, I'm reasonably prolific as it works with different networks. I'll take the communication any way you want to bring it, but have a good message and have a reason, explain why you've reached out to me. My Twitter DMs are open, which is very rare. And if it's just a random, hey, how you doing? I delete it and I block you and you're done. But if you say, hey, I read this story of yours, I write in this industry, whatever, and this is why I'm writing to you, you'll almost always get a response. So it really is less about it's less about the channel and more about the message in a lot of ways, if that makes sense.
I have a question. I'm trying to see how we can package it the best. I know you're editors, but I'm also curious to know the power of an organization. In this case, I work for the airport, Princess Juliana International Airport. But I can imagine the tourist bureaus and the other players in the industry, stakeholders and whatnot, may also be able to benefit. My question is, how important is it, and what's the impact that an organization has or get out of writing and telling their own story? So doing their own, keeping up their own website, making posts, etc.
I think for me at least, the downside of that is that you only bring one perspective to a potential story, even if you're talking about people or products or whatever. What we tend to do is that when we get a story idea, we may want to run with it and then say, well, I can tell that there's another perspective on this if I just call Adam, or if I call Bud and just ask what they think about this, that, or whatever. And it can completely change the story. So very often, company websites tend, I'm only speaking for myself here, tend to me to look kind of self-serving. It doesn't mean they don't provide interesting information, because very often that's where we get the numbers, the facts, the information about what a company does. But again, when people use lots of adjectives to describe what they make or what they do, we kind of tend to cut those out anyway.
You know what's an interesting part of a lot of organizations' websites is, there's the part that they really present up front to the public, the main page. But what is quite interesting often is that the organization also has an internal communications function, and it's also communicating with its own employees or stakeholders, and often in the form of a blog. And sometimes, you know, those blog entries, you go and look at them, and they're, hey, there's some really interesting stuff going on here, you know. And I've found several stories that way.
And I think, I don't want to encourage you to compete with me, because that would be stupid business on my part. But there are stories to be told. And I don't think that sort of an internal I'm going to start that over. I think it's good to be able to do that sort of thing because you have a direct relationship with your stakeholders, with your employees, with a different group of people than who I'm trying to sell a story to or push a story to. But you also have to understand that it's a different story. And so if what I'm looking for to publish to a broader audience, either B2B or B2C, is going to be different than what you're trying to push potentially to your employee group. Or, I mean, for you guys, it's easy to say, come to the beach and watch planes land. I don't know how many times you can write that story. I've done it several, so there's more to be done. But, you know, there is a place for that to be. But then it comes down to what is your end goal of investing that time? What's your return on investment going to be measured in? Are you going to measure that in bookings? For an airport, that's kind of hard in some ways because the airport itself doesn't necessarily drive passenger count. A bad airport can ruin passenger count, but a good airport doesn't necessarily drive it. And so, building up, trying to figure out what that ROI measurement is something you need to be really, really honest with yourself about before you make the investment to have someone who's, can do it. The addendum to that is when you commit to doing it, get someone who knows how to write and how to tell a story. That's not always easy to tell that you're not doing that, and people reading it will know very quickly.
My question is about how you like to receive news. So, for example, if I'm sending a news release, do you want it in the body of an email? Do you open attachments? What about high-res photos? Do you like links? What's the preference in 2017? And it may be different for all 5 of you, but I'm just curious about that.
I wouldn't send an attachment. Some organizations do, and you never know nowadays what's actually going to be a phishing email, well, there's more likelihood it'll go into, a writer's spam folder anyway, and then the writer is going to be somewhat reticent unless the writer really knows what the organization is. But it's just more bother opening an attachment than just putting the text or a short email. If you happen to know the writer personally, great. But if not, then really don't put a Word attachment or a PDF in. It's more memory. It takes longer to download, particularly in a place where the Wi-Fi isn't very good. I think writers just really prefer to see things, get things simply.
Yeah, I would say my favorite, and I use that term very loosely, is the one vendor who sends an email with an announcement in the headline that is a link to a PDF file that's compressed, so you have to double-click on a zip file to then open the PDF file to read what the story is. And you have to do all 6 of these steps, and in the headline is like personnel change, which I'm pretty sure I just told all these guys which vendor I'm talking about. But personnel change, and then 8 clicks later, and after the thing downloads, you realize, okay, so-and-so was senior vice president and is now executive vice president. That was a waste of a lot of my life and a lot of bits and bytes.
Very annoying.
The other thing I would say is I'm also happen to be a network IT kind of guy. Don't put lots of high-res images in the initial email. Let us ask for them, or say they're available and put them somewhere else. But email's not for large file transfers, and I build email systems, so I have to maintain them. So make my other half of my life easy, please.
So like using a Dropbox link.
Yeah, a Dropbox link. And yeah, there's a lot of those things, but that's after you've established the relationship of, I know who you are and this isn't a phishing attack or something like that, then I'm comfortable clicking on the link and have it ready to go, include the link in the initial email or don't. That can have an impact on what spam filters see and how they process things, of how many links there are to different sites, so that can actually work against you if you do it too much in the initial email. But if it's someone, as Chris said, if it's someone you've been emailing back and forth with the spam filters account for that these days, and it's like, oh, I know you, it's okay that you're sending me these random links. So I think and over time it gets easier, obviously, but at least in the initial ones, I would say we have high-res images. Here's a low-res showing what's cool. We have high-res images of this plus the 18 other things you might want to see.
I would
Quick
say,
follow-up. Oh, sorry.
as a general rule, in digital, the less steps, the better. So because at every step you may lose people. That's a golden rule of e-commerce, for example. Make it easier and simple. Yeah.
Quick follow-up question. Is there anything you absolutely hate? Cold calls, follow-up calls, anything that just immediately severs a relationship with a business?
Cold calls would be strange, but I don't think most writers get them very often. You know what my pet hate is, I write for a number of outlets, I have my own website. It's very clear from my website what it actually covers. Now, I get emails all the time from PR people, PR agencies, very often agencies, which I've obviously seen my name under a general travel category in some travel journalist list, and they send me all sorts of emails that are to do with nothing my website would ever cover, and very often product specific, hey, Chris, addressing me as if they know me, Chris, we've come out with this great backpack that has got a tag on it that if you lose it, it can tell you where it is, and would you like us to send you it? No, not really. I'm not going to be very interested. I get 1,000 of these, and honestly, I think probably it's true for all of us. We probably clear several hundred such emails out every day without looking at them.
Yeah, I think
And that goes back to doing your homework. What is that publication you're pitching? How does it fit in with what they're doing? Because you're up against with them. What's in it for them?
in my case, I would say email is the best way, but just make sure that your email is, it's not likely to end up in a spam folder. I can say when I got the invitation 2 years ago to come here to St. Martin, it was almost not happening because the email I got, first it went to the spam folder. I was lucky enough that I didn't do a mass delete, so I just I thought it could be something interesting, and I just opened it. But if not, I wouldn't be here. But it's something that applies to all sorts of emails. But I think it's the most effective way. If you can, as we said before, if we can put a couple of lines explaining why you have something interesting to talk about, that's the best way.
Two type of publications that we get a lot of offers. I'm talking on behalf of St. Martin Tourist Bureau, but I'm sure a lot of tourism boards get this, are of course in-flight magazines and destination magazines. Now, a lot of that comes from a heavily advertising perspective, but some of them even put a price tag on doing a story and such practices, which, okay, I guess it's their standard. However, in your opinion, those type of publications, how effective do you think they are nowadays, being that, there's more, like in-flight, there's more online entertainment, some people have Wi-Fi on their phone, are they even reading these magazines? And the destinations magazines as well, how effective are those in getting the real stories across to the ultimate buyer?
I think that most sort of upright, upstanding journalists would kind of abhor the idea of somebody calling you and saying, you give me a certain amount of money and we'll publish an article on you. I think that we all kind of recoil in some disgust about that, to be honest. I know it happens. Usually the kinds of publications involved are, their journalistic ethics are not great, They might print the most lovely stuff in the world about you, but it's probably, I think people who see that, it's not true, I personally can't speak to how influential. I don't personally tend to pick up in-flight magazines. I don't tend to pick up destination magazines very much. I certainly seen them in hotel rooms and so forth. But one of the nice things about a destination, I always find, is to actually go out and explore the destination yourself and make your own memories and your own it's always nice to have a map, admittedly. You know, I always find those useful on websites or even in hotel rooms. But yeah, I think I probably could speak for all of us if we're saying that none of us would really condone the practice of, or want to be involved in the practice of paying for articles.
Absolutely, with the caveat that I wouldn't write it, but if you can show an ROI on it, why wouldn't you pay, right? If you can spend $1,000 to make $1,500, that's a smart $1,000 to spend. And I know the number. I have no idea what the numbers are. I'm sure they're not those, but add more zeros. Yeah, a little higher. But you know, look at it as advertising, though. And this goes back to, we had the conversation earlier about, you know, what do you do about someone who promises you a story and doesn't deliver? That was an advertising spend that failed. And you have to look at what's your advertising spend, where are you putting it, and where is it working? I think that especially for luxury destinations, print and destination type magazines still have a lot of appeal. Those pretty glossy photos really still work. And so, you know, those magazines still have broad distribution in their target markets. So I think that there is still some value from that perspective. But if it's pay to play, you've got to take a hard look at what that pay is and what your ROI is going to become.
And there's another sort of interim category where, you know, the magazine will actually make clear that it's advertising, you know, or, as they say, advertorial, and then they'll label it as such. And that's kind of accepted practice, you know. Magazines will do that. I don't write such articles myself, but I have written for magazines that do run sponsored articles, and they call them that. They call them sponsored articles or advertorials, or this is an advertisement, so on and so forth. As long as it's labeled as such, then people know. But when you try and mix, you know, just from being sort of like having come up through, you know, over the years journalism, I think all of us have, we kind of recoil from the idea of not telling somebody that this is an ad, you know. But yes, access, right. I mean, if you reckon cold hard light of day business calculation that you can make a return on your investment, you know, $10,000 and you can make 20,000 by having this article printed, then go ahead. Particularly if it's got nice glossy pictures in it.
You should use his. He has a better ROI than I did.
I think one of the things you might ask is the person who produces the St. Martin magazine that's handed out on the American Airlines flights as you board. First of all, it weighs a ton. Second of all, I opened it up and I thought, oh, this is not a content delivery mechanism. This is an advertising delivery mechanism. So I leafed through it, and within 5 minutes, I was done, because there was no content in it that maybe this much content, you know, for an article. I thought, why, you know? So one of the people in my seat said, I didn't grab one, and I said, it's all yours, because I'm not taking it home with me.
Another thing to consider is that the whole in-flight magazine and in-flight content in general is being disrupted by new ways to stream content, not only online Wi-Fi, but lighter systems that can also provide the same type of internet-like experience, even if it's not full connectivity. That's an area where many interesting things are happening. And in a few years' time, I see the in-flight magazine possibly going the same way as the printed press. So it's going to be, you're going to have different formats to deliver this content. Maybe through sponsored content. Actually, one, besides being covering as a journalist, covering the industry as a journalist, I also work as a consultant on some technology-related projects that have to do with this area, and I can tell you it's lots of things are going on, and many airlines are looking at this space at the moment. So it's going to go really fast, I think.
For example, in terms of the Caribbean media space worldwide, with what's happening in Asia and other parts of the world, how intense? What percentage of the world is interested in what's happening here in the Caribbean?
Less than you want. Definitely less than you want, but I think that's everywhere, unfortunately. Getting news to a different part of the world about your region is troubling for everybody unless there's something terrible happening, which is not the news you necessarily want to have spread. So, I think the challenge there is partly to have, good news, which either happens or it doesn't, but also sort of to make your own news in terms of make the story about not necessarily what's going on the island, but why people, we're about tourism, right? You're about attracting people to show up. So it's got to be, you got to create the news create the stories and build these stories about why people should want to come here and have the experience with your country. And growing that idea, that's creating those stories, and this sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the human element and trying to make it that human touch to it. That's what's going to make stories resonate. That's what's going to make things pick up and go global. It's what made Leslie's pizza delivery story 2 years ago be so exciting and crazy and fun. It's that human touch and that human element. Those are the types of things that are going to help grow and sort of get the distribution you're looking for. But I think on a day-to-day basis, the number's not what you want it to be in general.
Yeah, and I would say that you yourself will know the markets where most of your travelers come from, and perhaps your publicity spend, as it were, is perhaps best directed to reinforcing those markets. Or if strategically you decide we've really got to try and break into the South American market or something where you might not be present right now, then that, of course, is a strategic decision, and you have to allocate the resources accordingly. But it might not work. It would be a gamble. Everything's a risk, as Rob Saravalo said earlier.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My question is as follows. I've heard from some of you that you've gotten stories already that you're going to talk about, write about on this occasion. How many of you have stories to tell when you go back? Okay.
Leslie's raising her hand too.
Yeah, Liz.
Thank you.
Our Toronto star person.
Just wanted to hear that for the record. Thank you.
Bring the mic over.
Maybe you can, I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but what advice would you have for destination that is, you'll say, off the beaten track, that looking to be discovered or is on the discovered and looking to be discovered, but is thinking of using the PR system, public relation offices, press releases and those kind of things, but mostly a public relation office to get that word out. But again, they are definitely not there as yet. What advice would you have for those destinations that is busy looking into being discovered by, the tourism industry?
Are you looking at an outside PR firm to do that, or are you talking about internally?
Well, the idea, there is already internally, but you are looking for more exposure, and more exposure is thinking that, if you hire a PR firm that is known or recognized, then you would get that exposure. But that could be false. So I'm looking at you guys as the professionals, the experts in the business to
I think it goes back to something we were talking about maybe during the Seaplane Forum, is that it's incumbent, I think, on the company, the organization that's hiring the PR firm to be as forthcoming as possible with the PR firm, because if they're any good, they're going to have people come in and they're going to ask a lot of questions. What makes this, why has this place been undiscovered for so long? What's changed now that makes it interesting? There's going to be 20 or 30 different questions. And the people that are running the organization, the destination, whatever, have to have some answers. They can't just say, I don't know, it's cooler now. It's nice. you have to give the PR people something to work with in order to develop the stories. And I know organizations that have hired PR firms, and they get upset later because the PR firm wasn't able to produce. And when the PR folks went to the organization and they said, just that, what about it? And they go, I don't know, you're the PR firm, you figure it out. No, it doesn't work like that. It's a symbiotic relationship. They need you and you need them, and you have to figure out a good way to work together to get to those little nuggets of whatever is making that really interesting or possible good story.
Here's another way to think about it. The bigger the PR firm, the more clients they have, the less time they're actually going to spend on your organization. You're just one of 1,000 clients to them, and they will charge you a lot of money, a great deal of money. You might get benefit out of it. Those big PR firms, they call themselves marketing firms nowadays, they of course have sizable resources, and they can get their message into pretty much every channel that the media might, journalists might see. But as far as they're concerned, they want your money. They've got posh offices in New York or Miami or wherever. They're very expensive. Some companies like using them specifically because they've got posh offices. I've often seen that using a smaller PR firm or even an individual PR person who's a freelancer or works for themselves can get you far more results because that person or a small firm is likely to work much harder. They've got a limited client base, and they're likely to work much harder on your behalf and be more responsive. To somebody like, I don't want to name any names, but to some of the big agencies, you're just another $10,000 a month, The
one thing I would say is, going back to Robert's comment about it's a symbiotic relationship, you have to really vet the people you're working with and make sure they understand what you're trying to sell, why you are special, what the it is, and then also make sure that when you're talking to them about what their reach is and what their approach is to finding the right people to try to sell the story to or get to run the story, make sure that it's not, oh, we've got a list of 10,000 people in the travel industry. We know this, we have segmentation that says we've got adventure travel, we've got eco travel, we've got luxe travel, we've got all these different things. We think that you fit here. Make sure that there's that understanding of what the market actually is, and also the resources that they've identified internally within their contacts, who the right people are to put you in touch with, who the right people are to publicize your destination. Otherwise, it's literally, you could just go have a bonfire with the bills, and it'd be kind of cool to watch the money burn. More exciting that way.
It's incumbent upon you to do your own research as an organization. And you audition PR firms, they don't audition you.
That we need to step back a little and, okay, your destination, it's off the beaten path, and it's a cool adventure travel or whatever, which puts you ahead of the power curve because that's what millennials want to do. It's what a lot of people want to do. They want to do something different. They want us to do something that gives back. They want to, there's a whole bunch of segmentation here. So first of all, you have to define who you want to bring, who you want to come to your island or your destination, and why do you want them to come? Is it high net worth individuals? Is it venture travels? It's who? So you need to do your own definitions, and I actually think fewer people do this than we think do this, because I've known a lot of airlines who just they want more passengers, but they can't tell me why or who. One of the new subscription airlines was very clear in the why and the who. We're not really going after travel publications. We're going after the publications the guys in Silicon Valley read. And I thought, ooh, that's exactly who he should be going after. So he's not going after travel publications. He's going after the Wired magazine. He's going after other, tech magazines. And so that was a huge lesson for me. And so it's, first of all, defining who you want to come and finding what they read. And then place yourself, you know, if they've got a travel thing, place yourself somehow in that. And especially if you've got a unique destination experience.
And if you're asked by a writer or someone else who you're trying to influence or who you're trying to target, and your answer is everybody, trust me, you haven't done your homework.
Yeah, you haven't
really
done your homework.